The damn sewer pipes are actually expensive! Was my biggest reaction to the inevitably botched attempts at building a functioning city in Workers and Resources Soviet Republic. The reference is to another modern-themed city building and management game, City Skylines, whose jauntier look is very much in line with how demanding the management part of it is. It takes the player very little skill to turn City Skylines into a city painting simulator where you color chunks of land green, yellow, and blue and bring all the pipes and other utilities there as an afterthought before the money floodgate opens even further. In contrast, once you go past the glorious theming of Workers and Resources, you realize that every bit of expansion, every block of flats, every article you decide to make domestically is an uphill battle against space, logistical pressures, and multiplying costs. Unclogging the toilets of the people is hard, important, and expensive work after all. This game is a conveyor-rollingly or crunchingly, copter-choppingly developmental paradise where you start with loans to build a bakery and end up exporting hundreds of thousands of tons of coal and selling hundreds of millions worth in train sets and tanker ships. This game has incredible potential for swallowing you whole, but it does demand a lot from the player, and it does hide many deadly traps for the uninitiated. I'm about 180 hours in at the time I'm writing this, and back at the start, I jumped right off the deep end with no regrets since. Other than crippling loneliness and disastrously missed work deadlines. That's right! Deep end means that you should set maximum difficulty settings to properly enjoy Workers and Resources, because the management details and trickery is where the game truly shines, even if it means flushing a fair few initial cities down the sewer pipe you failed to build. And with a little bit of experience I've managed to gather, I can share a few insights into bolstering your play as a beginner, as we will discuss how to start out, what industries to look into, how to transport stuff better, and how to make people not want to leave you. So the first thing you do in this game is... We have already discussed the difficulty settings, and I strongly recommend you to set up a map with high population already in it. When I just started with the game, I switched this option off because, like probably many people, I prefer more of a clean slate in these games rather than trying to sort out the garbage that the scenario designer or the map generator foist upon you. But for a beginner of Workers and Resources, the villages seeded across the map offer a huge benefit. For one, you obviously can and should use one of them as the basis for your city, sparing you the initial cost of some of the houses and roads. I also like having to play around with something other than the basic street grid. Two, you can save a lot of money rounding people up from the rest of the map and shunting them into your city instead of inviting foreign migrants. This can be a game changer and will make it far easier to overcome the poverty trap, especially if you have to weather a massive depopulation disaster because, I don't know, your shiny new houses did not get any water because the pipe supplying it is too small and the power plant doesn't get enough water too and works at reduced efficiency and doesn't send enough electricity anywhere, and now you're thirsty, hungry, deathly sick people fumble in the dark for the toilets which are already full of poo, and the game fails to tell you about it in time. Without the safety cushion of people living elsewhere on the map, this can easily become a game-ending event. The final point is the churches. People want them and will get pissy if they don't get any, and you can't build them. However, pre-generated villages usually have churches, which is another good reason to build your initial stuff in one. You're not supposed to be able to do anything else about this issue this early in the game, not before you set up radio and television stations to do the baby Jesus bashing propaganda for you. This is an incredibly stupid mechanic, and not only because it takes away agency from the player, but also because it reveals a lack of nuanced knowledge about the topic of religion in the Second World, as the game kind of falls back to this hammy Reaganite strawman of, "You want church? You'll have to look for churches in the Gulag, comrade." Since you can't switch it off in the settings, I recommend looking at ploppable spiritual buildings in the workshop. I personally like this morning hall. It's small and ugly in this adorable and painfully municipal way, and is appropriately civic and non-denominational. Two additional things to consider for the location of your first settlement are the trade connections and the proximity of resources. You are very likely to end up somewhere in a corner of the map, close to the custom station of both a Soviet and a Western nation, for easier access to rubles as well as dollars. We'll discuss this later. Making sure that you can import and export electricity and that there is a railway link. Exports are the only way for you to earn cash. There's no foreign aid like in Tropico or family remittances, which could be a really interesting mechanic for that East German flavor. Shorter distances to the sources of the cash mean less road building, less road cleaning, less fuel spent, less need for vehicles. And speaking of shorter distances, make sure your first city is close to natural resources. Oil is usually abundant and is an easy first priority, followed by iron ore and coal. You need lots of both for steel, which can multiply your income and curb your expenses. The rest, perhaps leave them for when you're bigger and richer. So, we found the spot, let's get building. One of the big draws of workers and resources for me is in its detailed construction process. As you set up the supply of all of the resources you need, buy all of the cool tractors, bulldozers, and cranes, and watch it all come together, making every building more emotionally significant and valuable. I certainly won't forget spending a couple of game years setting up this entire nuclear production line, from uranium ore extraction to the humongous and wonderful power plant, and then finally launching it. The gradual resource collection and construction mechanic is nothing new, and it's been around since games like Settlers, Knights and Merchants, or Populous, and it has the familiar downside of being too slow and tedious when not everything is perfect. Workers and resources circumvents this by letting you spend cash on construction if you want to. And here's why you should start avoiding this as early as possible and avoid it as hard as you can. The game tutorial covering the construction system does a good job of explaining the topic, but glosses over two important points. The first is that you don't need to set up any of the industries to make the resources you need for your construction warehouses. You don't have to do it in purely technical way, but you also don't need to do it to play well. From steel to prefab concrete, you can buy it all automatically and not worry about just buying the stuff you need. Not at first anyway. Also, developing your own industries is expensive across the board, and you just don't have the money to do that. I'll even go out on a limb and say that some of the construction industries aren't really worth getting into unless you're trying for maximum self-sufficiency because of their low margins. So buy those warehouses, gravel hoppers, and asphalt factories. Start purchasing small quantities of inputs, and once you get some essential buildings like houses, a kindergarten, a grocery shop erected for cash, go build stuff yourself. Because of the other points the tutorial doesn't mention, and it's the fact that work costs money. Every buildable object in the game takes a certain number of man days, from a few hundred to set up a pub to hundreds of thousands to put together a tank vessel. It's a huge input in the cost of everything, and the ratio of the price of foreign labor to local labor can be easily as high as 8-to-1. You obviously don't pay locals anything, but the game conveniently calculates the estimated man day price, presumably based on the services and goods you provide to the people. Here's an example. I want to convert this piece of dirt road to gravel road in the middle of nowhere because, you know, you need to splurge sometimes. The game tells me it'll cost me 1,326 rubles or $1,675. Now, I don't make any gravel myself. I'll have to buy it anyway, so let's subtract its cost from the price. This is the cost of all the work shoveling that gravel. Divided by the number of man days necessary, we get a rate of almost 24 rubles and $33. Compare it to the tiny local rate of 3.24 or even 2.5, about an eighth and a 13th of the asking price, for a final cost of building that road of this many rubles and this many dollars. So as you can see, foreign workers do cost a lot and can blow a huge hole hole in your wallet. Meaning that you should get local construction going as early as possible so that you can make use of this advantage in as much of your project as you can, especially when your incomes are low and you have to power through a lot of borrowing. You can argue that because local construction is always slower, you're kind of trading time for money, and this is always something to consider when choosing how to build stuff. It makes sense to throw money at something urgent to correct a critical mistake or clean up an emergency. Also, unless I'm very strapped for cash, I prefer paying for my roads because of how much their construction tends to take, even with efficiently supplied resources. Alright, good. We have a few buildings with people who are fed and drunk, and all the poopy goes down the right drain. What's next? Without any doubt, industry and its development in your square little country takes up a lion's share of the delightful management puzzle of the game. More importantly, exporting stuff your people make is the only way to generate any income, and Workers and Resources offers an incredible array of buildings that turn things into other things. And so big it is that if you don't know what you want, you might end up doing weird experiments like importing processed bauxite to convert it into alumina and then exporting it back because you don't have the cash to build a factory to convert it into aluminium, and you don't need aluminium to begin with. This is actually an enjoyable part of the early exploration of the game, and it will almost certainly ruin you in the process, time after time after time. Now, if you're looking for efficiency and building up your assets, there's a different way. Ask yourself, what do I or my people need? And at the beginning of the game, it's certainly all sorts of construction materials, it's food, it's meat, it's alcohol, and clothes. This is what you should look into for initial development, specifically the consumer goods, because as I've pointed out already, construction industries are either not particularly profitable or demand too much upfront investment. Making your own food or booze serves as a great first step for a few reasons. One is security. You get an internal source for these staple products, and the populace won't immediately go hungry if your money dries up and forces you into the downward spiral of borrowing to survive. 2, it replaces existing imports with your own production, thus avoiding the cost of buying. This means that you effectively sell your products at the higher purchase price and not at the lower sale price for additional profit. These factories are also relatively small and inexpensive to build. They're not insane polluters, and they don't take in many workers to bring up to full production capacity. Remember that setting up the housing and all the amenities for the workers is a huge hidden cost of developing an industry. Crops, the main input for these factories, are cheap, and agriculture is a really simple and inexpensive way to make value out of nothing, offering a nice option for your second industry that feeds crops to your initial stuff. Finally, producing food and alcohol offers pretty good returns on your investment. The game clearly shows what every factory consumes and makes, which means you can plan your future income and choose what to build. To do that, I usually calculate the profit a factory generates per man day, assuming for simplicity that I buy all the inputs in Roubles and export all of the output. Let's look at the food factory. It consumes a maximum of 42 tons of crops a day, costing us about 2,400 and a bunch of water, which I don't count as it's exceedingly easy and cheap to produce at home. Plus, there's 170 man days, in this case 4.45 rubles each, for a total of 756.5. The factory generates 20 tons of food that I sell for some 8,400 rubles. The difference is just over 5,200 rubles a day. I then divide this number by the number of workers in the factory. Why? Because factories rarely work at full capacity. Plus, all factories require workers as a resource, so this is a good metric for comparing them in terms of how much return I get for building up all of the municipal infrastructure to get and keep the people in. In the case of the food factory, it's 30.9 rubles of profit per man day. It's virtually the same for alcohol at 30.7, while for bricks it's a fair bit less, with 23 and 22.2 for prefab panels. workers. There are limitations to this because the game has obviously very expensive plants that are more profitable per worker, like the cement plant that'll eat up 600 grand up front, but then return 56.4 for every man day you invest. And this is by far not the limit, as we'll see. Plus, you have inexpensive facilities that rank high, like the gravel processing plant with its 54.3, but the problem is that they don't generate much value in absolute numbers, and you'd have to initially invest a triple or even quintuple of the cost of, say, a food factory to match the actual income it can give you. And don't forget that your own consumption of something like food is constant, meaning that some of the food you make will always sell at a higher price for even better profitability. In other words, for your first industries, confidently go food or maybe alcohol. They are solid early game moneymakers, and combined with farming, they offer a secure foothold for more expansion into other crops-fed consumer industry, namely clothing and meat. Another useful area to look into as your next big thing is exporting electric power. It is very lucrative because it takes very few workers to actually man the facilities, and you don't need any vehicles going back and forth to export electricity. So it doesn't eat fuel, does not depend on weather and your road drawing skills, and offers a continuous stream of easy cash. Which means that you can comfortably take out huge loans against that fixed income without worrying about not having the money at times, as it happens with a seesawing income from delivering and selling usual commodities. I'm kind of surprised that the game doesn't have hydroelectric power, especially since the Soviet Union was known for building big hydro plants, and since in 1960 all the other types, including those burning fossil fuels, were still a bit of a novel thing. But in any case, I think the gas/oil power plant is the best choice here. It is pricey, and so is the infrastructure for extracting oil, but the benefit is that you don't need any people to get the oil, and the plant itself just takes 15 workers. So once the physical stuff is built, you get as close to constant income for not doing anything at all as you possibly can. Also, that oil part, it's not nothing. It's the beginning of something beautiful, something phenomenal, something special. It's... My god, oil is great. Workers and resources, my arse. It's sheiks and skiers, the Gulf Republic. And in it, oil is the best thing you can do to not worry about money, to never take any new loans, to spend tens of millions accidentally buying ship licenses, to grow and develop as you please. It is your sweet petroleum-soaked ticket out of poverty. By oil, I actually mean oil refineries and the really valuable fuel and bitumen they make, unlike oil itself, which is not that expensive and tends to fluctuate in value a lot. The thing is, the margins of running oil refineries are absolutely bonkers, as even if you buy the oil you refine and the electric power the process needs, you will generate 83 rubles per man day in profits. An absolute steal compared to all the other industries we looked at. But you can actually take it a step further and set up your own oil extraction network. As we've just discussed, you don't need people smashing stuff with huge wooden hammers for the oil to flow wherever the pipe leads it, so given enough money, you can cover your entire country in a spider web of pipelines feeding your giant petrochemical enterprise. Just build the pipes, the pumping stations, and set up the power lines to keep them running. I don't even bother providing the fire services for some of that infrastructure out in the hinterland. So what if a pump burns down? Your profits are easily enough to replace it tens of times over. If you supply domestically extracted oil to your refineries, their profitability soars to 131 rubles per man day. At full capacity, that's 65,500 a day and almost 24 million a year. Nuts! Now, whenever I do these man-day calculations for a factory, I usually don't assume locally produced inputs for that factory to be free. I just use the lower export price rather than the higher import price for that input. This is to represent the cost of opportunity, using that locally made product for further processing in a factory instead of just sending that product abroad. This better estimates the added value the factory generates as part of a production chain. But I don't do this with oil refining because oil pumps and pipelines do not need any labor to run, or any other inputs for that matter, save a little bit of electricity. They're essentially a part of the refinery. This is in sharp contrast to coal, iron, or uranium mines, which are very labor-intensive and are less of a build-and-forget kind of thing. The challenge with oil is the huge capital investment needed to get the industry running. An oil refinery alone costs anywhere from 500k to $1 million. Then add maybe dozens of pump jacks to supply the refinery with enough money juice, an expense item you'll probably mostly have to cover the cash because this infrastructure will be too distant for your construction officers. And then add a town of workers to keep the refinery running, with a population of 3 to 5 times more than its worker limit to comfortably get it to capacity. Then add the distribution and export infrastructure with storage tanks and loading stations and some more pipes. This is actually a good point to get into trains because their chunky upfront cost will be tiny compared to the rest of the project. With all of this in mind, if you are wondering if you should get into the whole rich petro swine business, my answer is yes. The answer to whether you should do it right now depends on your ability to raise 3 to 5 million in long-term loans without plunging yourself into financial abyss. Go for it. And since we're mentioning them, let's talk about snake-like things that go chew. Yes, train is good. Yes, ship is big. Yes, chopper is surprisingly great for construction. And yes, cargo cable cars. Because I don't know. The game miraculously has it all, so now what you do is take all of them, give them a gentle pet for the road, and dump them dramatically in the bin and forget they ever existed. Because you are a mess, and you are stinking poor, and you don't deserve better things. Trucking is what you are. It is what you get. I know all these options are incredibly alluring, especially the railways, and you will rely on them for most of your cargo and passenger traffic eventually. Their problem when you're just beginning, though, is twofold. For one, big and efficient transport infrastructure comes with huge upfront costs. They are not intractable, but as a fledgling city, you have far more urgent things to spend your limited money on, like building up your exports. Lorries and the associated infrastructure are cheap and will do enough to keep you out of financial trouble for a while. And speaking of exports, the second problem is that you are simply not going to need big and efficient transport infrastructure because you're not going to make enough stuff. A measly food factory squeezes out 20 tons of grub every day, and if it isn't too far from the border, a handful of trucks are gonna do the trick exporting it. A train can do so much more, and train. Look at this tanker and despair at tens of thousands of tons of fuel and bitumen you can stuff it with. That's a year's worth of at-capacity production by like 3 or 4 oil refineries. The simple takeaway here is don't let yourself be fooled by the siren song of signal horns, and don't get into the heavy stuff unless you have a good reason to use it. Unless you're selling tens of thousands of petrochemicals and you're too loaded to do good management, in which case you might as well draw lines on maps like a dum-dum. Your little country doesn't stand alone and has to find its way growing through the sea of the rest of the world, and trade with all kinds of people, whether savory or not so much. With 2 currencies, dollars and roubles, the game very roughly mimics the somewhat interesting positions second world countries, usually heavily embargoed, found themselves when it came to trade. From the player's perspective, it's an interesting tactical tool that you can use to carve out nice efficiency benefits or avoid losses, though completely disregarding it probably isn't going to hamstring you as much as some of the things I've included in this video. But you don't really need to disregard it completely, and the most general rule of thumb that you should always follow is to make sure that you have income in both the currencies so that you can properly use this whole two-currency mechanic. This is another good reason to build a power plant early on. You're probably going to spend more in rubles as you start because of Soviet migration and some desirable vehicles, which means that selling your main exports for rubles is a great idea. But building a power line connecting you to the West and selling some juice on the side for dollars can quietly create a nice reserve that you can dip into for things like construction materials or even consumer goods and raw materials if something goes wrong and your ruble supply dries up briefly and you can't afford another loan in ruble. There is also the question of prices. The currencies deflate and inflate, and at least in my experience, the ruble starts more expensive than the dollar in 1960, but tends to lose value over time. This is another good idea to sell more stuff in more stable dollars, at least as a way of building a reserve and keeping rubles as more of an everyday fare, especially since, once again, most of your migration will be from the Soviet bloc, and most of the vehicles you buy will be from there too. Nice Western exceptions being limited to stuff like harvesters and buses. And speaking of vehicles, if you're planning on building and exporting them, don't expect to sell them in dollars, as the profit margins are going to be really low compared to rubles. So if you are looking for more dollar income here, you can do a little detour by selling your vehicles for rubles, use the rubles to buy inputs for your factories, and then make stuff that yields better profits when sold for dollars. And obviously, use every opportunity to build the stuff you need yourself to skip the whole trading shenanigans altogether. Those license fees may appear steep, but you will dilute them into non-existence with every vehicle you make. Also, don't shy away from bringing third world migrants for dollars. It's a really cheap way to get people, especially early in the game when rubles are expensive and you need them everywhere. The fact that most of these people lack basic education is trivial. You need to have good education facilities anyway. Basic education doesn't take long, so you can avoid punishing your ruble wallet too hard by trading these people yourself. All in all, the currency system is not something that you should or would want to pay attention to constantly in workers and resources. It's certainly not worth it. But an occasional look at your trading accounts to see what you buy and sell and in what currency and where the prices are going is a really good idea for a bunch of reasons, and currencies doing currency stuff is actually one of them. As you play and build your city, you will almost certainly have to deal with the problem of people inexplicably disappearing from their houses over time, with you probably not even noticing that at first. This is annoying on a purely practical level, making you click those buttons inviting migrants all the time, but significantly, this can become a huge drain on your finances and can be game-ending for a budding city. As an additional poke of aggravation, the game is terrible at telegraphing the reasons for this, at least in its current form. A building that says it doesn't have any problems might be dying out, and one with the usual not enough kindergarten, sports, or whatever other issues just sits there stinking happy and won't depopulate. We'll discuss a couple of reasons for that, and the first big invisible killer, just like in real life, is pollution. Virtually all of your industrial facilities and a few others produce different quantities of pollution, as clearly said in the info sheets for these buildings. In practice, as you might expect, this means they just draw a dirty circle around the building that people don't like to live in. While plopping your houses right next to factories sounds like a reasonably dumb idea in real life, the game doesn't tell you how severe the consequences of doing that are in the game. The peeps that's what it is. The solution is obvious. Set up zones of exclusion for your factories. Make sure that there are at least 200 to 400 meters separating your houses from the polluting stuff. You can use all that space on stuff that doesn't care, like storage, civic buildings, and all sorts of utility structures, or just plant trees. The distancing does mean worse walkability, so include public transport in your neighborhood design as well. A well-placed station plus a train set will flood your factories with workers. And if you end up with a city where homes do mingle with steel mills, make moving either the homes or the factories your first priority. You can build a few pollution monitoring stations for a better picture of what needs doing, and here's an example from my own city. I used to replenish the houses next to this consumer goods and chemicals complex with people all the time. Now, the industry is gone, moved closer to a huge agricultural project I'm working on, and the area has become incredibly desirable for living. Nobody's bitching about that benzene and cyanide floating about, and everyone there now takes a cool, fast train to that plastics plant they're working at. The second sneaky problem making people want to leave are the brownouts. You will see the brownouts, which sadly have nothing to do with brownies, as the lights flickering in your city at night. This indicates insufficient power supply, and spikes in it can sap the happiness of your citizens considerably over time, both through bad electricity service to the houses themselves and the unstable operation of the other stuff they use, like water pumps. The game will point at your power substations having too many connections sometimes, and this can be a reason, but as you will quickly discover, adding and connecting more substations usually doesn't do anything. The cause for this is easily solvable, but unfortunately something you have to know. The transformer plants that you use to turn high voltage into medium voltage have an effective total demand cap of 2 megawatts. If the consumers connected to it eat more than that, you will have problems. The solution obviously is setting up new transformers and rerouting some of your excess demand through those. This actually has a positive corollary in that there's zero reasons to build really high-capacity, high-voltage lines everywhere, because the lowest and cheapest 8 or 10 megawatt lines will work just fine for all applications, except for some of your critical backbone lines and power export connections. Lastly, let's talk about heating. Winter is nasty and hard on workers and resources, and low temperatures can be a major cause for population loss in your city. The heating plants are easily buildable, of course, but they are big polluters, so resist the temptation to plop one in the middle of your residential zones, expecting to heat them directly. The solution is to kick these plants out into the industrial exclusion zone and supply heat to people through heat exchangers. What? That's it? Winter problem solved? Mostly yes, but here's a little caveat. Don't expect heat to be as easily transportable as electricity. There are huge losses involved with distance, and every pumping station between the supplying plant and the consuming exchanger easily gobbles up about a third of the energy transported. Forget about plopping a huge heating facility, and there are really ginormous ones in the workshop, somewhere out in the boonies, and bringing heat to all the cozy homes in your country. You should strive not to have heat pumping stations in your systems at all, balancing the distant limit for your heat exchangers and the pollution radius of the supplying plant, which isn't that hard in fact, but still an approach worth following. And this is it for today. I think I've covered everything that gave me serious trouble, or conversely, made it possible for me to achieve serious success, but perhaps wasn't too obvious. Workers and Resources has comfortably earned a place among my staple games, and certainly is a game I will uninstall and consciously avoid for how addictive and engrossing it is. I haven't discussed everything there is to discover in this game, with examples like farming, distribution offices, semaphores, and various types of storage facilities, as well as more worthwhile stuff in the game's richly populated workshop. And trust me, you will have to go to the workshop if you get far enough in the game, as some of the vanilla buildings are pathetically unsuited for any large-scale development. And obviously, let's not forget, Workers and Resources is still in early access. The developers are regularly adding new stuff, so let me know if you'd like me to do another video covering more mechanics, or maybe even do a stream expanding on the playthrough I've been showcases throughout this little guide. It does have a long story at this point, provided that I don't decide to delete Workers and Resources, because I want my life back.